I will never forget June 18th, 1985. The sky was clear, and the sea seemed calm, almost defying the stories surrounding the Bermuda Triangle. For many, that place is shrouded in mystery and legend, but for us in the US Navy, it was just another area of operations. I already had 12 years of experience as a rescue diver, and over time I had learned to approach these missions with professionalism, without letting superstitions influence me. Even so, there was something about that morning that made me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. We were aboard the USS Sentinel, a vessel equipped with the most advanced technology the Navy could offer at the time. High-frequency sonar, submersible drones, and a team trained to handle extreme situations. I trusted the equipment, and, even more, I trusted the men and women by my side. We had been assigned a relatively simple mission: investigate abnormal signals detected at approximately 800 meters deep. This type of operation was routine for us. A few days of work, data collection, and that was it. Another mission completed. The mood on the ship was lighthearted despite all the preparations. Some of the sailors joked about the legends of the region, talking about ghost ships and missing planes. I myself had heard dozens of those stories. Some, I admit, were fascinating, but at that moment, everything seemed far from reality. Captain Reynolds, as always, stayed focused. He was a firm leader, the kind you'd follow anywhere without question. His confidence was contagious. As we approached the investigation area, the tension began to build. The anomalous signals detected by the sonar were unusual but not alarming. What really caught the crew's attention was the consistency of the data. Something strange was down there. It wasn't a typical shipwreck, nor did it seem like a geological accident. There was a structure, solid and unmistakable. The captain ordered the drones to be deployed immediately. I was in the control room when the first image came through. The central monitor showed a vast expanse of sand on the ocean floor, interrupted by something that didn't make sense. It was a metallic structure, smooth in appearance, as if it had been sculpted with a precision I had never seen before. It seemed to reflect the drone's light in a strange way. Lines and geometric patterns ran along its surface, forming a kind of mosaic that appeared to change shape depending on the angle you looked at it. Silence filled the control room. It was as if everyone was trying to process what they were seeing. I could hear Jackson's heavy breathing, one of the drone operators, while he adjusted the cameras to get a more detailed view. "This shouldn't be here," he murmured. Captain Reynolds approached the monitor, analyzing every detail of the image. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, but I could see the tension on his face. Finally, he broke the silence. "Prepare the divers," he ordered. His voice was firm, but there was a slight hesitation I had never heard before. I knew he was trying to stay calm, but something about that object had unsettled him. As I prepared for the dive, my mind was racing. What was that thing? A secret military experiment? An ancient structure? Or something entirely different? I tried to push those thoughts aside and focus on the task at hand. As a rescue diver, I had learned to deal with the unexpected, but at that moment, I realized nothing in my training had prepared me for this. I put on my diving gear with the help of one of the technicians and checked every detail. Jackson and Miller would be my companions on this descent. Both were experienced and reliable, but I could see the same unease in their eyes. No one said anything, but the silence was heavier than any words could be. We descended slowly, accompanied by the drones, which continued to illuminate the structure below us. The pressure of the ocean felt more intense than usual. When we finally reached the bottom, the sight was even more impressive than the images on the monitor. The object was larger than I had imagined, roughly the size of a car, and was partially buried in the sand. Its surface was flawless, showing no signs of wear or corrosion, as if it had been placed there recently. I approached cautiously, examining every detail. The material was unlike anything I had ever seen on Earth. It wasn't just metallic, it was magnificent. Jackson, who was beside me, seemed equally fascinated. "What the hell is this?" he asked over the communicator. I had no answer. None of us did. That's when we noticed the opening on the side. It was a kind of circular portal, about a meter in diameter, which seemed to have been activated by the presence of the drones. The light from our equipment reflected inside, revealing an empty space, yet it felt full of possibilities. "We should wait for orders," I said, trying to maintain caution. But before we could make a decision, the captain's voice came through the communicator. "Enter," he ordered. My heart raced. I knew it wasn't the best decision, but I also knew that orders were orders. Whatever that thing was, we were about to find out. And deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The first thing I felt upon entering the structure was absolute fear, as if the sound of the ocean had been sucked away. It was eerie. Jackson came in right behind me, followed by Miller, and I noticed they were just as cautious as I was. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, but perfectly symmetrical. The material lining the interior was as smooth and polished as the exterior, but there was something odd: the temperature. Despite being 800 meters deep, where the cold should have been biting, the air, or whatever it was, had a mild, almost pleasant warmth. The lights from our helmets illuminated the interior, revealing details that hadn't shown up in the drone images. There was a softness to the curves, a fluidity in the design, as if every piece had been molded seamlessly without visible joints. It was hard not to marvel at it, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Perhaps it was the tension of the moment, or maybe something within that vessel was truly observing us. It was Miller who first noticed the sphere. It was inside a transparent case, right in the center of the structure. The case appeared to float, held in place by supports. The sphere, on the other hand, was utterly mesmerizing. It glowed with a silvery light that seemed to pulse, almost as if it had its own rhythm. For a moment, we were all transfixed, unable to look away. It was as if that thing was alive. "Is this energy? Technology? Life?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. He stepped forward, but I stopped him with a gesture. "Wait," I said. "We don't know what this does." Still, the curiosity consumed us. How could it not? We were standing before something completely out of the ordinary, something that had no business being in that place, or on this planet. The captain, who was monitoring everything over the communicator, ordered us to retrieve the sphere. We hesitated, but once again, orders left us no choice. Carefully, I used a tool to try to open the case, but before I could touch it, the lid slid smoothly to the side, as if the vessel itself was obeying me. That should have been our first warning that we were dealing with something far beyond our comprehension. Miller reached out and took the sphere. As he lifted it, the light inside it glowed more intensely, almost as if it were reacting to his touch. Around the panel, other objects began to catch our attention. There was a kind of pistol, or at least something that resembled one, though its design was incomprehensible. It was compact, with no visible buttons, and gave the impression of being incredibly advanced. We also found 5 metallic rods, about 30 centimeters long, covered in markings and symbols that made no sense. On one side of the room, there was a larger device, resembling a portable computer. Its screen lit up with a touch, displaying a strange interface filled with lines and symbols that constantly rearranged themselves, as if trying to communicate with us. The most intriguing item, however, was a cylinder. It was connected to the floor of the vessel by almost imperceptible cables, and its surface pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of the ship. Everything about it suggested that the cylinder was crucial, perhaps the energy core of the ship. I wanted to touch it, but something held me back. It was as if a silent voice in my mind was pleading with me to stop. Captain Reynolds instructed us to collect what we could, but it was clear we couldn't take everything in a single mission. We decided to retrieve the smaller items: the sphere, the pistol, the rods, and the computer. We planned to return for the cylinder and perhaps even attempt to transport the entire vessel to the surface. It was an ambitious idea, but in the heat of the moment, no one questioned whether it was wise. As we carried the objects back to the ship, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was as if the vessel were alive, and our departure with those items was more than just a recovery. It felt like theft. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something, anything, coming after us. But everything remained still, with only the sound of our equipment and the echo of water surrounding us. Back on the USS Sentinel, the atmosphere changed immediately. It was as if the ship itself was reacting to the presence of those artifacts. The lights in the compartment where we stored the items began to flicker, and the technicians responsible for inspecting them seemed uneasy, though no one wanted to admit it. I submitted my report to the captain, but as I described what we had seen, I realized my words couldn't capture the magnitude of what we had found. There was a mix of euphoria and apprehension among the crew. We had discovered something that could change everything, but at the same time, no one could ignore the feeling that we had crossed a line. I knew I shouldn't have allowed us to touch those objects. Something inside me screamed that we had made a mistake, but it was too late. As I prepared to rest, one thought haunted me. Whatever that vessel was, it didn't seem abandoned. It seemed like it was waiting for someone or something. And now I feared that we had awakened that something. When we returned to the USS Sentinel, it didn't take long for the atmosphere aboard to change drastically. There was something unsettling in the air, a strange tension none of us could quite explain. The artifacts we brought back were stored in a secure room, isolated from the rest of the ship. Specialized technicians took on the task of cataloging and monitoring each item, but even as I walked through the corridors, I could sense that things were no longer the same. The ship felt different. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, we had just experienced something that defied all logic. But then, the disappearances started. First, it was 2 sailors. They had been assigned to guard duty near the compartment where the artifacts were stored. It was a straightforward task, uneventful. But suddenly, they vanished. When we reviewed the security footage, what we saw made no sense. The images showed the 2 men walking up to the entrance of the room, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, the footage became distorted. The next scene showed the room empty. No sign of them, no explanation. Their equipment was left behind. Rifles, helmets, even their communicators. It was as if they had evaporated into thin air. The crew was in shock, but Captain Reynolds tried to maintain control. "We'll figure out what happened," he said, but his voice carried a hesitation I had never heard before. As the sailor's disappearance was being investigated, something even more disturbing began to unfold. The captain, who had spent more time in the artifact room than any of us, started to change. At first, it was small things. He seemed distracted, stumbling over his words in meetings or forgetting basic commands. But as the hours passed, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began speaking incoherently, mentioning things that made no sense. "They're coming," he muttered once, staring intently out of a window. Soon, his physical appearance began to change as well. His eyes took on a strange glow, a faint greenish hue that shouldn't have been there, as though something was taking hold of him. His skin, usually healthy, began to show markings that looked like burns, though there was no indication of pain. On the contrary, he seemed almost indifferent to what was happening to his own body. The medical team was summoned, but no one knew what to do. He had no fever, no abnormal vital signs, except, of course, for the visible changes. The crew was torn between their concern for the captain and the growing fear that something was very wrong with the ship itself. Some started reporting strange sounds in the hallways, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Others swore they saw shadows moving, even when no one was there. I, too, began to feel that something was off. One night, as I walked toward the artifact room to check on the guard shift, I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. 2 days later, Captain Reynolds passed away. He had been isolated in the infirmary under constant surveillance, but in the early hours of the morning, the monitors started setting off alarms. When the medical team entered, they found him lifeless, his body covered in dark marks that now looked like alien bruises. His eyes remained open, with that greenish glow that no one could explain. The captain's death was the tipping point. Fear took hold of the crew. People began avoiding certain areas of the ship, especially near the artifacts room. It was as if that place had become a forbidden zone, something that everyone instinctively knew was better to avoid. But the problem was that the artifacts seemed to exert some kind of influence. Some technicians reported feeling an inexplicable pull toward them, as if the objects were calling them. Tensions rose even further when we began to notice failures in the ship's power. The lights flickered for no apparent reason. Communication systems failed at critical moments, and the most sensitive instruments began showing completely bizarre readings. It was as if the USS Sentinel was slowly being taken over by something from another planet. Jackson, who had dove with me on that mission, started having frequent nightmares. He said he dreamed of the sphere, always pulsating, always emitting that hypnotic glow. In one of the dreams, he said the sphere was speaking to him, whispering words in a language he couldn't understand. He woke up sweating, terrified. But the worst part was that many of us were having similar dreams. There was one night when I woke up in my bunk, breathless, after a nightmare that felt far too real. In the dream, I was back at the bottom of the ocean, inside the ship. But this time, it wasn't empty. Something was there with me. A presence I couldn't see, but could clearly feel. I woke up with the sensation that I wasn't alone in the room, and for a long time, I couldn't fall back asleep. Reports of strange sounds, shadows, and eerie sensations continued until no one felt safe aboard the USS Sentinel. I knew, we all knew, that the artifacts were the cause of this. But by then, it seemed too late to do anything. Their influence had spread, and the entire ship seemed to be on the brink of collapse, just like us. As we approached the coast, the anxiety aboard the USS Sentinel was almost suffocating. We knew that NASA had already been contacted, and that scientists would meet us to analyze the artifacts. But until then, the tension on the ship was unbearable. Power failures were becoming more frequent, and the disappearances continued. 2 more sailors had simply vanished the night before, just like the first ones. No signs, no traces, just an emptiness that haunted us. The next morning, we were urgently called to the room where the artifacts were stored. The ship's power had completely failed for about 2 minutes, and when the system came back online, the technicians realized something was terribly wrong. All the artifacts had vanished. The room, which had previously been sealed and under constant surveillance, now appeared empty, as if it had never contained anything. But that wasn't all. When we reviewed the security footage, we found something that still haunts me to this day. The recordings weren't just damaged. They showed something impossible. For a brief moment, before the screen went to static, you could see the outline of 4 bizarre figures in the room. They seemed humanoid, with small heads, long arms, and were wearing some sort of metallic uniform. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything vanished. The crew started to panic. Everyone was convinced that we had brought something evil aboard, something that didn't belong to our world. Some started locking themselves in their cabins, refusing to leave, while others roamed the halls in a state of paranoia, armed, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. In the meantime, the technicians tried to access the footage taken by the drones during the expedition to the bottom of the Bermuda Triangle. But the files were completely corrupted. There was no sound, just static and distorted images that, at times, seemed to show unrecognizable shapes in the background near the ship. All the evidence we had, the videos, the photos, even the digital reports, was damaged beyond repair. It was as if something had erased our entire investigation, as if it wanted to erase its own existence. Shortly before we reached the coast, something even more disturbing happened. A terrifying noise echoed through the ship, coming from all sides at once. It was a continuous sound, something that seemed to resonate from within the sea. We rushed out of our cabins, trying to understand what was happening. When we reached the deck, we saw something none of us would ever forget. On the horizon, the ocean's waters were churning, but in a strange way. Enormous waves were forming. And then, amid this chaos, we saw a light. It emanated from beneath the surface, pulsing like a giant heart. It was the same silvery glow we had seen in the sphere, but much larger, much more intense. Suddenly, everything went silent again. The noise stopped, the ship stood still, and the light disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, as if something had taken off from the bottom of the sea. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had stopped. And then, without warning, the ship's lights flickered and went out completely. We were left in the dark, surrounded only by the sound of the ocean. When the emergency lights finally came back on, the first thing we noticed was that the control room was in chaos. The ship's systems were completely offline. Everything seemed to have been wiped out. Even the digital clock had stopped, frozen at the exact moment the light appeared. Finally, after all that chaos, the next day we reached the coast. I won't go into details about how we managed to report everything to NASA, who now saw us in a different light. The USS Sentinel was declared inactive by the authorities and was scuttled and lost at the bottom of the sea, along with what happened that day. Now, 40 years later, I hear rumors of a new expedition to the Bermuda Triangle. I want to scream for them to stop, to leave it buried. But who would believe me? Who would believe that, at the bottom of that treacherous sea, there lies a ship that is not from this world, carrying a sinister secret that should never have been discovered?